At 6:42 a.m., November 7th, 2025, a silent shock rippled across Europe. At the VFS Visa Center in Moscow's Kortashevsky district, more than 3,800 applicants stood in a line that wrapped around 3 blocks. Students, business owners, engineers, and wealthy elites clutching folders of documents worth thousands of dollars in fees. They expected delays. They expected scrutiny, but no one expected what came next. At 7:01 a.m., Brussels issued a single sentence that detonated across the continent like a political earthquake. Effective immediately, all multiple-entry Schengen visas for Russian passport holders are suspended indefinitely. Within minutes, border alarms activated in Poland, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Germany, and Austria. Flights were halted, digital entry permits were voided, barriers at the Brest and Kozlovici crossings dropped into locked position with steel reinforcement. For millions of Russian citizens, every bridge into Europe vanished in seconds. By 7:19 a.m., social media across Europe exploded. The Iron Curtain is back. Putin has trapped his own people. Europe just cut Russia off for good. In Kaliningrad, a region that once depended on fluid movement to neighboring EU states, residents woke up to a logistical nightmare. Ticket prices skyrocketed from $180 to more than $2,300 overnight. Sea routes became the only option, and even those required multiple layers of screening. Meanwhile, Russian elites in St. Petersburg and Moscow scrambled to understand how their villas in Nice, their accounts in Spain, and their children studying in Zurich had suddenly become unreachable. And then the unthinkable happened. As Russian citizens tried to leave, they discovered that the European shutdown was only the first half of the shock. The second half was waiting for them at home, engineered by their own government. To understand why Europe executed one of the most sweeping mobility shutdowns of the 21st century and why it detonated with such force inside Russia, one must look at the deeper chessboard forming throughout 2024 and 2025. This was never just about visas. It was about a silent, escalating confrontation between Russia and the European Union, a confrontation fought not with tanks, but with drones, sabotage networks, economic coercion, and political infiltration. On one side stood Vladimir Putin, determined to project power far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. On the other side stood a continent that initially tried to handle Moscow with calibrated diplomacy, reluctant sanctions, and cautious warnings. But as the months unfolded, European leaders realized they were facing a conflict unlike anything they had seen since the Cold War. This was a hybrid war, a multi-dimensional battle that blurred the line between military hostility and civilian disruption. By early 2025, the warning signs were no longer subtle. NATO recorded repeated airspace violations, including a dramatic incident on September 19th, when 3 Russian MiG-31s ignored all radio calls and flew deep into Estonian airspace for 12 full minutes. Intelligence services across Scandinavia reported persistent drone harassment above strategic locations, including bases hosting America's most advanced F-35 fighter jets. Technical analysis later linked several of these unmanned flights to Russia's Shadow Fleet, a network of vessels operating covertly in the Baltic Sea. But the most alarming shift did not come from the sky. It came from the ground. In March 2025, Europol issued a classified warning to EU capitals, later leaked to major outlets. According to investigators, Russian intelligence had begun recruiting local organized crime groups to carry out acts of sabotage on European soil. Rail lines, military logistics hubs, and even civilian infrastructure were flagged as potential targets. Suddenly, the Kremlin's hybrid war was no longer theoretical. It had crossed into Europe's internal space. The contrast between the two power centers could not be more pronounced. Russia deployed cheap drones worth a few $1,000s to threaten aircraft worth $90 million. It used low-cost criminal networks instead of uniformed soldiers. And while Russia relied on asymmetry and deniability, Europe relied on bureaucracy, intelligence, and alliances. It was asymmetric warfare, but from both sides. What made this moment globally significant was that the battlefield was not Kyiv or Donetsk. It was Copenhagen Airport, Oslo's military zone, the Finnish border, and the streets of Warsaw. It was Europe's sense of internal security, its very identity, that was under threat. Against this backdrop, the EU's November 7th decision no longer looked like a visa policy. It looked like a counterstrike. And for Moscow, it signaled something far more dangerous. Europe had stopped reacting and started reshaping the battlefield. The shutdown on November 7th did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the final step in a chain of escalating confrontations that unfolded across Europe throughout 2025, each incident more brazen, more coordinated, and more alarming than the last. By the time Brussels acted, the continent had already endured months of pressure from a Kremlin determined to test the limits of Europe's patience. The buildup began quietly. In March 2025, Europol's internal report landed on the desks of EU interior ministers. Buried within its pages was a revelation that shocked even seasoned intelligence chiefs. Russian security services were systematically recruiting local organized crime groups to carry out sabotage inside the European Union. Payments flowed through cryptocurrency channels. Orders were delivered through Telegram. Targets included rail hubs, logistics lines feeding Ukraine, and dual-use infrastructure stretching from Poland to Germany. What had been whispered for months was now documented. Europe was inside the battle space. Then came the second escalation, this time directly at Europe's borders. On September 12th, Poland announced the indefinite closure of its two major crossings with Belarus, Brest and Kozlovice. These were not ordinary border points. Brest alone handled more than 3,000 daily crossings, including legal trade, business traffic, and civilian movement from Russia through Belarus. By shutting them, Poland effectively severed one of Russia's most important land bridges into the EU. It was a physical wall, long before the bureaucratic wall arrived. Moscow responded with something far more confrontational. On September 19th, 3 Russian MiG-31 interceptors violated Estonian airspace and refused all NATO radio communication for 12 uninterrupted minutes. This was no navigational anomaly, it was a deliberate probe. The jets flew close enough to sensitive radar arrays that NATO scrambled fighters in response. The message was unmistakable. Russia was testing NATO resolve, hoping to find weakness. Instead, it triggered unity. Just days later, Scandinavian intelligence services confirmed a second provocation, this time involving unidentified drones near some of the most valuable military assets on the continent, the F-35 squadron stationed at Copenhagen and Oslo airports. Defense analysts quickly ruled out civilian origins. Technical signatures traced the flights to Russia's covert maritime fleet, often referred to as the Shadow Fleet, a network of vessels built to operate in gray zones where Moscow could deny involvement while still applying pressure. This was escalation layered on escalation. Air, sea, and ground incidents blended into a single pattern. Hybrid war was no longer a theory, it was active. But then came the twist that Europe had long feared and the Kremlin had long relied on. While Russia escalated militarily, it quietly opened a legal infiltration corridor. Serbia, though not an EU member, enjoyed visa-free access to the Schengen zone. Through a series of agreements signed after 2022, Serbia and Russia deepened intelligence cooperation. What looked like diplomatic alignment masked a strategic loophole. Russian elites and intelligence officers were quietly obtaining Serbian citizenship, allowing them to move through Europe undetected. When investigative platforms exposed this backdoor in mid-2025, the revelations stunned EU officials. Among the individuals holding Serbian-Russian dual passports were operational officers tied to Russian internal intelligence, allies of top Kremlin security figures, industrial executives linked to weapons development. It was a Trojan horse, but one built with legal paperwork rather than smuggled soldiers. The third major twist came in the United Kingdom. In May 2025, 6 Bulgarian agents operating on behalf of Russian intelligence were convicted for running a spy network embedded deep inside London. Their activities included surveillance, targeting of political figures, and attempts to manipulate public narratives. Days later, another case emerged, a 66-year-old British citizen attempting to sell sensitive defense information to what he believed were Russian agents. These were not isolated incidents. They were fractures in Europe's internal security. By the fall of 2025, pressure reached a breaking point. Poland dismantled a 32-person sabotage cell, the largest captured since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Their missions? Disrupt supply lines, damage military storage sites, and derail aid shipments. For EU leadership, the message was now undeniable. Russia had moved the battlefield inside the European Union. The war was already here. The visa blockade of November 7th was not Europe's first move. It was Europe's final warning. The bridges that once connected Russia to the West, legal, physical, financial, and political, had been burned, one by one, by the Kremlin's own hand. By the time Europe shut its doors, the hybrid conflict had reached a level where neither diplomacy nor warnings could contain it. The escalation was complete. The European shutdown did far more than block travel. It dismantled the foundation of Russia's economic arteries, diplomatic maneuvering, and internal balance of power. The impact was immediate, cascading across multiple layers of Russian society, and the Kremlin was not prepared for the scale of the blow. The first shockwave hit the Russian middle class. For decades, European travel was more than leisure. It was a pressure valve. Before 2022, more than 4.7 million Russians visited EU countries annually, spending close to $3.5 billion on tourism, education, and business trips. Even after the invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands continued using multi-entry Schengen visas to escape rising authoritarianism. Cities like Berlin, Riga, Tallinn, Vilnius, and Helsinki became lifelines for Russians fleeing repression or looking to maintain economic ties. The November 7th shutdown severed those lifelines instantly. Single-entry visas, now subjected to enhanced security screening, transformed into a bureaucratic gauntlet. Applications that once took 7 to 15 days ballooned into 8 to 16 weeks, with rejection rates soaring beyond 90%, according to regional reports cited by DW and BBC Europe. For many Russian families, especially those in Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, and Pskov, the consequences were personal. Children studying abroad became unreachable. Elderly parents could no longer travel for medical care, and families split across borders suddenly found themselves isolated. The second shockwave hit Russia's professional and technological workforce. Since 2022, an estimated 850,000 to 900,000 Russian IT specialists, engineers, designers, and researchers had left the country, according to Reuters and independent economic surveys. Their plan was straightforward: relocate to transitional hubs like Georgia, Armenia, Serbia, and Kazakhstan, then move on to Europe for long-term stability and higher-paying work. With the new EU restrictions, that path vanished. Tens of thousands of skilled workers now faced an impossible choice: remain in limbo in countries with shrinking opportunities, or return to Russia, where mandatory conscription, censorship laws, and political surveillance threaten their future. The third shockwave struck at the heart of Russia's political elite. Multiple entry Schengen visas were not just travel documents, they were pillars of elite identity. Russian oligarchs and senior officials built empires based on a dual existence, earning money in Russia while living luxuriously in Europe. The shutdown suddenly restricted access to villas on the French Riviera, bank accounts in Austria and Spain, vineyards in Italy, private schools in Switzerland, offshore trusts in Cyprus, luxury medical clinics in Germany and the UK. The Kremlin had long maintained a fragile social contract with its wealthy supporters. Stay loyal, stay quiet, and their Western lifestyles would remain untouched. But as of November 7th, that contract collapsed. Several analysts cited by Reuters and The Guardian described the move as the biggest psychological shock to Russia's upper class since the invasion of Ukraine. If sanctions were the financial blow, the visa shutdown was the cultural and emotional one. The fourth shockwave hit Russia's economic and industrial networks. Even under sanctions, Russian companies maintained indirect trade channels with Europe, relying on in-person meetings, business exchanges, and technical consultancy, often conducted quietly in neutral EU states or through subsidiaries. But without access to EU soil, these channels closed. Engineers could no longer attend European trade fairs, negotiate machine imports, or certify industrial equipment. Defense News reported that the inability to send technical staff abroad hampered Russia's attempts to modernize critical components in aerospace and energy sectors. This isolation deepened the technological gap between Russia and the West. The fifth shockwave struck Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania. With land borders effectively closed and EU airspace access restricted, Kaliningrad's 1 million residents found themselves trapped. Flights skyrocketed in cost. Ferry routes faced heavy screening. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly described the region as a strategic pressure chamber, dependent on Moscow but surrounded by NATO. And finally, the sixth shockwave hit the Kremlin's internal cohesion. Elites who once tolerated Putin's authoritarian system now faced material consequences. Russian intelligence veterans and political observers noted growing resentment among influential circles. Resentment directed not at Europe, but at Putin himself. The hybrid war meant to pressure Europe had instead cornered the very people who sustained the Kremlin's power. In just one morning, Europe transformed a visa system into a geopolitical weapon. It struck Russia's middle class, its workforce, its elite, and its supply chains, all without deploying a single soldier. The result was a strategic impact far deeper than any embargo or missile strike. This was hybrid retaliation at the highest level. The fallout from Europe's November 7th shutdown did not remain confined to Moscow or the Schengen borders. Within hours, ripples spread across NATO headquarters in Brussels, defense ministries in Washington, intelligence circles in London, and strategic planning rooms in Beijing. The closure of Europe's bridges to Russia reshaped global alignments, exposed vulnerabilities in multiple regions, and accelerated a geopolitical shift already underway since 2022. What began as a European decision quickly evolved into an international recalibration. At NATO, military planners recognized that Europe had taken a decisive step traditionally associated with Washington: the use of administrative power as a strategic weapon. The alliance had already been dealing with escalating Russian provocations, airspace violations, drone reconnaissance, sabotage networks uncovered from Warsaw to London, but the visa shutdown fundamentally altered the operating environment. By closing entry points to millions of Russian citizens, the EU effectively limited Moscow's ability to deploy covert operatives, logistical facilitators, and intelligence assets under the cover of civilian travel. NATO analysts noted in internal briefings, cited by Defense News, that the move removes Moscow's most cost-efficient infiltration method into the European theater. Meanwhile, the United States, under the Trump administration in 2025, viewed the European decision as both a security enhancement and a strategic opportunity. Washington had long argued that Russia's hybrid warfare capabilities were enabled by Europe's openness. Now, with Schengen access drastically restricted, US intelligence agencies expected a measurable reduction in Russian influence activities across the continent. At the same time, the US military leadership saw a chance to strengthen forward deployments. With Europe more aligned on security, American F-35s in the UK, Poland, and Norway faced fewer political constraints. Joint exercises across the Baltic region accelerated, reflecting a renewed sense of unity. This realignment had consequences far beyond the West. In China, policymakers were quick to study Europe's strategy. Beijing had watched Russia's hybrid experiments carefully, adapting several techniques for its own influence campaigns. Now, China also watched Europe's response. Chinese analysts in state-affiliated think tanks recognized that if Europe's visa weapon proved effective, similar measures could be used against Chinese elites if future tensions escalated. This raised concerns in Beijing, where thousands of officials and their families maintain real estate, education plans, and business ties in Europe. China also found itself facing a difficult balancing act. On one hand, Beijing benefited from Russia's increasing isolation. Russian energy exports flowed at discount rates, and political dependence on China deepened. On the other hand, China risked becoming Russia's only major partner outside Iran and North Korea. That level of dependency was strategically dangerous. In early December 2025, Reuters noted a quiet but notable shift. Chinese officials began urging Moscow to stabilize relations with the European Union, fearing that a fully isolated Russia could become unpredictable. In the Middle East, the visa shutdown influenced power balances in unexpected ways. Gulf states, especially the UAE and Qatar, had become popular destinations for Russian elites seeking new havens after sanctions. With Europe closed, inflows accelerated. However, this surge created tensions with Western governments. Several Gulf leaders speaking anonymously to international media worried that hosting Russian oligarchs could invite scrutiny or secondary sanctions. The UAE's financial regulators quickly tightened due diligence requirements on incoming Russian capital. Europe's shutdown, in effect, forced Moscow's elite into a shrinking circle of refuge. But perhaps the most striking global impact came from the unprecedented comparison between cheap Russian tools and expensive Western systems, a theme that reshaped defense debates worldwide. Russia's drones, often costing less than $20,000, had harassed facilities hosting NATO's $80 to $95 million F-35 aircraft. Saboteurs equipped with tools worth a few $100s attempted to disrupt rail systems transporting military gear worth billions. The hybrid war revealed a dangerous truth. Modern conflict favors asymmetric actors who exploit the cost imbalance. This prompted urgent discussions among NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Israel. Defense News reported that the US Department of Defense pushed allies to rethink cost-per-effect strategies, investing more in counter-drone systems, artificial intelligence targeting, and electronic warfare. Europe's visa shutdown added a new layer to this doctrine: deny adversaries access to the civilian and logistical channels they rely on for low-cost operations. Even countries outside the conflict zone felt the shock. Southeast Asian nations, already wary of espionage and influence activities, quietly updated their own visa procedures. Australia's security agencies ramped up scrutiny of foreign investors. Canada, which had dealt with Russian-linked cyber operations, publicly supported Europe's approach and signaled it could follow suit. But perhaps the most profound global dimension was psychological. The era of globalization, where borders blurred and mobility was assumed, suddenly revealed its vulnerability. A major world power had been cut off by administrative means, without a single shot fired, without a blockade enforced by ships or jets. This demonstrated that a modern geopolitical isolation could be achieved not by war, but by bureaucracy. Over the next 3 to 6 months, experts predicted several scenarios. Scenario 1. Russia intensifies hybrid attacks to retaliate, using drones, cyber attacks, and proxy groups. Scenario 2. Kremlin elites grow increasingly restless, pressuring Putin to restore mobility and economic access. Scenario 3. China distances itself slightly from Russian escalation to avoid being dragged into new sanctions. Scenario 4. NATO accelerates fortification of its northern flank, anticipating further provocations near Finland and the Baltic Sea. Scenario 5. The EU expands its visa crackdown to include associated states or any country serving as a Russian backdoor. Each scenario carries risks. Each scenario reveals a new global front, and each scenario shows how a single European decision reshaped the strategic landscape far beyond the borders of the continent. The world now watches not tanks or missiles, but paperwork and databases, tools that may prove more destabilizing than weapons. When dawn broke on November 7, 2025, few understood that Europe was about to redraw the geopolitical map without mobilizing a single brigade or launching a single interceptor. Yet, by the end of that morning, the European Union had executed a maneuver more disruptive than an embargo, more immediate than a sanctions package, and more painful for the Kremlin than any battlefield setback. It severed Russia's bridges, physical, financial, cultural, and political, using nothing more than administrative precision and collective resolve. This was not simply a visa suspension, it was a strategic rupture. Millions of Russian citizens found themselves isolated. The middle class lost its escape routes. Technological and professional talent lost its mobility pipeline. Elites lost access to the luxury and security they had spent decades cultivating in Europe. Kaliningrad became a pressure chamber. Intelligence operatives lost the cover networks that had enabled hybrid operations across the continent, and the Kremlin lost the confidence of many who once tolerated its rule for the sake of Western privileges. Europe's message was unmistakable. The era of asymmetry had ended. The continent that once operated cautiously, often reactively, finally matched Russia's hybrid aggression with its own non-military weapon, one designed to deny Moscow the civilian access it had exploited for years. The shock still reverberates. In Washington, defense analysts saw a historic shift toward coordinated Western security doctrine. In Beijing, policymakers worried about the precedent such a move could set. In the Middle East, safe havens for Russian wealth grew uneasy under new scrutiny. And inside Russia, both ordinary families and powerful elites confronted the consequences of a geopolitical gamble that suddenly became far too costly. Yet the world is now left with profound unanswered questions. Will Russia retaliate with a new wave of hybrid attacks across Europe, escalating the shadow war that triggered this shutdown? Will internal pressure from elites and professionals force the Kremlin to make concessions? Or will it harden into deeper isolation? And most importantly, with Europe now wielding bureaucratic power as a strategic weapon, is the global era of open borders and easy mobility coming to an end? No one can answer these questions with certainty, but one thing is clear. November 7th, 2025 marked a turning point, a moment when Europe chose security over access, unity over hesitation, and strategy over fear. A moment when a continent long accused of moving too slowly suddenly acted with unprecedented speed and precision. The world will be watching what happens next. Thank you. And if you want more deep dive cinematic analysis of global security, make sure to subscribe and follow the next chapter of this unfolding story.